Everybody see this?
Yes.
Okay. Hopefully today we will finish the digestive system. Chapters 24, it's chapters 24, part 1 and part 2. So at any time, if there's any questions, please let me know. This is a chapter with a lot of new words in it that you've never heard before. So if there's a question, make sure you stop me. We're going to talk about the organs and the physiology of the digestive system. This is an overview. Here it is. Your digestive system starts in your mouth and ends in your anus. And there are a lot of organs involved in the digestive tract and also sensory organs that are involved in the digestion and absorption of food and water. So basically, the GI tract is a long tube that's open at both ends for the transit of food during processing. And this tube starts in the mouth, goes into the esophagus, into the stomach, into the small intestine, into the large intestine, and into the rectum, and then out into the toilet, I hope. Accessory structures, which are not part of this long tube, contribute to food processing. In the mouth, you have tongue, teeth, and salivary glands. You also have the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. They all help in the process of food and water. Basically, there are 6 processes involved in digestion. The first thing you do is ingest the food. It goes into your mouth, and then there is secretion of enzymes. And that actually starts in the mouth. There are enzymes in the mouth, which we'll talk about. Then the food moves into the esophagus and then throughout the entire GI tract. And obviously that's called motility. The food is also broken down into smaller molecules, and that's called digestion. Now, there are 2 types of digestion. Mechanical digestion, which basically is in the mouth, and chemical digestion, which basically is in the stomach and small intestine, but it also occurs in the mouth. There are enzymes in the mouth also. Absorption. 90% of all absorption is in the small intestine, and we'll talk much more about the small intestine when we get to part 2. And then defecation. The feces has to leave, and those are the 6 processes: ingestion, secretion, motility, digestion, absorption, and defecation. Okay? Now, there are 4 layers to the mucosa of the GI tract. The outside layer is called the serosa. Here is the serosa right here. Basically, it's connective tissue. Once you go through the serosa, you get to the muscularis. The muscularis is what propels the food down the GI tract. It's in every part of the GI tract. And normally, there are 2 types of muscles that are in the muscularis of the GI tract. There is circular muscle and there is longitudinal muscle. However, in the stomach, there is a third layer of muscle. And that third layer of muscle is the oblique muscle. So there are 3 layers in the stomach of muscle, and throughout the GI tract, there are 2 layers of muscle. Once you go through the muscularis, you come to the submucosa, and that's where all the glands are. All the glands are in the submucosa. And then you have the mucosa. The mucosa is what touches the food. All right? So you have an inner layer of the mucosa, the submucosa, the muscularis, and the serosa, going from in to out. I would know those layers. Anyone remember MALT? What's MALT? Mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue. What's the function of MALT? Does anyone know? Somebody guess. Go ahead, guess. You learn this in the lymphatic tissue lecture. What's the function of MALT? Why do you need lymphocytes in your GI system?
Does it have something to do with an immune response?
Yes, it does. It does. Okay. What if you're eating something and, like, say you're eating peanuts and you're allergic to peanuts? The lymphocytes in the MALT system will attack those peanuts and you will have an allergic reaction. This is why this MALT is very important. It also kills bacteria too. Okay? So that's why you need lymphocytes in your GI system. It's not important to me for you to know the neural innervation of the gut, but here's a question that I may ask you on exam number 3. When you are at rest, what autonomic nervous system controls your GI tract? Is it the parasympathetic system or the sympathetic system? I got plenty of time. I can wait all day.
What was the question again, Professor?
When you are at rest, what autonomic nervous system controls your GI tract? Parasympathetic or sympathetic?
Is it parasympathetic?
Yeah, it's parasympathetic, right?
It's parasympathetic. That's the resting system. Parasympathetic, okay? That's very, very important. Very, very important. If you are stressed, let's say you were in a car accident and you're very, very stressed and you have a broken femur. Do you need blood supply or nerve supply to your stomach?
No.
No, you don't. You don't. It takes it away. The GI system basically works best at rest. At rest. When it is excited, when you're stressed out, what do you think the GI system does?
Stops or like doesn't work as much?
It doesn't work as much and doesn't work as well, and it may work in reverse. How would the GI system work in reverse if you saw something that made you feel sick?
You would throw up?
Yes, you would throw up. You would throw up. What if you're scared to death? You may even have diarrhea. So, you know, the GI system works best when you are at rest. That's my point. Okay? There are many reflex pathways that regulate motility and GI secretions, but it works best at rest. You don't have to know any of this slide. Just know that the reflexes work when you are at rest, and it's controlled by the parasympathetic nervous system. Okay? Now, in AP1, you learned about serosal membranes. The peritoneum is the largest serous membrane in the body. And if you can remember correctly, a serosal membrane has two layers. The outside layer is the parietal layer, and that parietal layer covers the cavity. And the visceral layer covers the organs. Now, there are multiple organs in your peritoneal cavity. So the visceral peritoneum covers the stomach, the liver, the pancreas, the gallbladder, the small intestine, and the large intestine. It is the largest serous membrane there is. And the parietal peritoneum covers the cavity, the peritoneal cavity. Okay? The peritoneum is divided into many sections. Here are the sections: the lesser omentum, the mesocolon, the mesentery. Those are the three sections of the peritoneal membrane. There are more sections. I think the next slide may show it. Let's see. Yeah, they do show it. Here are the other two. There are 5 different sections of the peritoneal membrane. Here we go again. Here's the 3: lesser omentum, mesocolon, and mesentery. But the most important is the greater omentum. The 5th one is the falciform ligament. These two, in very bold letters, are the 2 most important parts of the peritoneum. The falciform ligament covers the liver, separates the right and left side of the liver, a very important ligament. The majority of the peritoneum is the greater omentum, the greater omentum. This is known as the beer belly in fat people. Whoop. In fat people. This yellow stuff is fat. So the fatter you are, the bigger your greater omentum is. And the greater omentum covers everything below the stomach. Okay? Here it is. It's actually below the stomach. So again, there are 5 sections of the peritoneum. There is the lesser omentum, the mesentery, the mesocolon, the falciform ligament, and the greater omentum. I guarantee you, I will ask a question on one of the parts of the peritoneum. Okay? Here's the mesentery. Here's the greater omentum. Here's the falciform ligament. So know the 5 different parts of the peritoneum. All right, let's start at the mouth. There will not be many questions on the mouth, okay? I can tell you right now, I'm not going to ask you any questions on teeth, all right? No questions on teeth, but there will be some questions on the mouth, okay? The mouth has teeth. You have a hard palate, a soft palate, a uvula, which prevents swallowed food from entering your nose. It's like the epiglottis of the mouth. The epiglottis prevents food from getting into your trachea, and the uvula prevents food from getting into your nose. Okay? Don't worry about teeth. I'm not going to ask you about teeth. That's not important to me. Okay? But you also have your tonsils, you have your tongue, and you have your gums. All right? You also have salivary glands. Salivary glands are in your mouth. Mechanical digestion starts in the mouth. Chemical digestion starts in the mouth. Your salivary glands empty their contents into ducts, which deliver saliva into the oral cavity. The 3 pairs of salivary glands in your mouth are parotid, submandibular, and sublingual. What does submandibular mean? Where are these glands?
Is it below the jaw?
Under your mandible. You are correct. Where are sublingual salivary glands?
Under the tongue?
Mm-hmm. Under your tongue. Correct. Where are the parotid glands? The parotid glands are actually in your cheeks. In your cheeks. Okay? Anybody ever heard of mumps?
Yes.
Mumps is a viral disease of the parotid glands. Okay? So that's important. That's important. Parotid, submandibular, and sublingual, and they're on both sides. There's a right and a left, a right and a left, and a right and a left. All of these salivary glands produce saliva. And here they are. Here's the parotid gland right here. Here's the submandibular gland. And here's the sublingual gland. There they are. Okay? Know them. Know them. And know what comes out of them. And I'll talk to you about that in a second. So let's go back. Let's go back. Salivary glands produce saliva. Saliva consists basically of water. That's the most abundant material in saliva, but it also produces enzymes to start the digestion of food. I'll say this again. Mechanical digestion starts in the mouth. Chemical digestion starts in the mouth. The 2 enzymes that are produced by the salivary glands are amylase and lipase. Whenever you see the word amylase, it is an enzyme that degrades carbohydrates. It digests starch. So if you eat pasta and such like that, you'll start digesting that immediately in your mouth. The word lipase is an enzyme that digests fat or lipids. So lipase digests lipids, amylase digests carbohydrates. Now, I'll tell you right now that there are other glands in the digestive tract that produce amylase and lipase. And when we get to the pancreas, we'll talk about amylase and lipase more, because the main producer of amylase and lipase is the pancreas. The tongue. I'm really not going to ask any questions on the tongue, but the tongue is a muscle on the floor of the mouth that not only participates in chewing and swallowing, but also participates in speech. And if you had the special senses in AP1, your professor hopefully talked about taste buds, which I'm not going to talk about. Okay? I'm not going to talk about teeth. The only thing that is important to me about teeth is the periodontal ligament. Periodontal ligament. This is what holds your tooth in place. It anchors your tooth to the underlying bone. Okay? The periodontal ligament. Don't worry about this slide. I'm not going to ask you any questions on the different kinds of teeth. That's not important. Again, there's a difference between mechanical and chemical digestion. Mechanical digestion in the mouth is the chewing of food, mixing with saliva to form a bolus which can be swallowed. Chemical digestion takes place with enzymes. And again, the salivary glands produce two enzymes, amylase and lipase. Amylase converts polysaccharides to disaccharides. It attacks starch, carbohydrates. Lipase digests lipids or fats. So here's where you see salivary glands secrete saliva, and here you have amylase. Amylase. It splits starch. It splits starch into smaller fragments. You go from a polysaccharide to a disaccharide, and disaccharides are maltose, maltotriose, and we'll talk more about that when we get into metabolism. And then you have the lingual glands, which secrete lipase. Lipase attacks fat, otherwise known as cholesterol and triglycerides, and it's broken down into fatty acids and glycerol or diglycerides. All right? All right, let's leave the mouth. We're now going into the pharynx. We talked about the pharynx when we talked about the airway. So you know where the pharynx is, okay? And the pharynx is composed of skeletal muscle. So the food leaves the mouth and goes into the pharynx and then goes into the esophagus. The esophagus is a collapsible muscular tube that lies behind the trachea and connects the pharynx to the stomach. The one important point I want you to remember about the esophagus is that there are no enzymes produced by the esophagus. It's just a transit tube. There are no enzymes produced by the esophagus. Okay? And I'm not going to ask you the layers of the esophagus. That's not important. That's not important. Okay? The act of swallowing is called deglutition. The tongue shapes the food into a lubricated bolus and moves it to the back of the mouth. The tongue rises against the palate and closes the nasopharynx, so no food can get into the nose. The uvula and the palate help to seal off the nose. The epiglottis covers the larynx. Breathing is temporarily interrupted when you swallow anything. So that's very, very important. Swallowing. You relax the muscles of your esophagus and everything contracts, and the bolus of food goes from the esophagus into the stomach, into the stomach. There is a regulator right here of food coming into the stomach. And that regulator is called the lower esophageal sphincter. It is a muscle. And that muscle allows food to get into the stomach. When there is a problem with the lower esophageal sphincter, you have a condition called GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease. And the food and the acid and the enzymes that drop into the stomach go back into the esophagus. And you're going to have a lecture on that by one of your fellow classmates on March the 30th. GERD, okay? The esophagus, here it is. The esophagus only secretes mucus. It does not secrete any enzymes. Its function is to drop food into the stomach from the mouth. Now we get into the stomach. The stomach is a J-shaped enlargement of the GI tract. It is divided into 4 regions. And those 4 regions, I want you to know. It is the fundus, the cardia, the body, and the pylorus. So it starts in the fundus. And then all the food gets into the stomach and moves. Not only does it move, it is now becoming digested. And remember I told you that the GI tract has 2 muscle layers. Those 2 muscle layers are the longitudinal layer and the circular layer. But in the stomach, there is a third muscle. And that third muscle layer is the oblique layer. is the oblique layer, okay? So food is being digested and moved through the stomach. The area of the stomach is controlled by what we call rugae. Rugae are folds in the stomach that can make the stomach bigger so you can get more food in if you decide to eat too much. So it will enlarge, giving you more surface area, and that is known as rugae, the folds of the stomach that allow more food and digestion to take place. So it goes into the fundus, into the cardia, into the body, and out through the pylorus. The pylorus is the distal end of the stomach. There is a control mechanism to let food out of the stomach. It is a muscle. That muscle is called the pyloric sphincter. The pyloric sphincter controls the amount of food coming out of the stomach into the small intestine, okay? And the first part of the small intestine is called the duodenum. We'll talk about that in a few minutes, but this is the stomach. Many digestive chemical processes occur in the stomach, and we will talk about them. Okay? Here's rugae. Here they are. These are the folds of the stomach that enlarge to accommodate more food. Here you can see it. Here you can see it. All right? The functions of the stomach: to move food into the duodenum, to store that food until the small intestine is ready for it. A combination of food, saliva, and gastric juice, which we'll talk about, forms a mixture called chyme. Another function of the stomach is to secrete gastric juice. And we will talk about gastric juice because it contains hydrochloric acid. It contains an enzyme called pepsin. It contains intrinsic factor, which we'll talk about, and it contains another enzyme that digests fat called gastric lipase. The stomach also secretes a hormone called gastrin. There are many cells in the stomach that are extremely important. And the next slide talks about these cells. But the cells are the mucus cells, the parietal cells, the chief cells, and the G cells. And here are the cells of the stomach that I want you to know. Surface mucus cells and neck cells secrete mucus for lubrication of the chyme to get through the stomach. The parietal cell secretes hydrochloric acid to literally break down the chyme. Intrinsic factor. The parietal cell secretes intrinsic factor. Without intrinsic factor, you cannot metabolize vitamin B12. vitamin B12. And you know from your blood system that vitamin B12 is essential in the DNA of red blood cells. So the parietal cell secretes hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factor. The chief cell secretes a protein called pepsinogen. When pepsinogen comes in contact with hydrochloric acid, it is converted into an enzyme called pepsin. Pepsin is an enzyme that degrades protein. So now in the stomach, you start protein degradation. Remember, in the mouth, you started degradation of carbohydrates and fats. But now in the stomach, you have pepsin, which is formed when hydrochloric acid attacks this protein, pepsinogen, and forms pepsin. And now you have protein digestion. The chief cell also secretes lipase, gastric lipase, and all lipases degrade fat or lipids. Also in the stomach, there is a cell called a G cell, and that G cell secretes the hormone gastrin. That hormone stimulates the parietal cell to secrete hydrochloric acid. So all these cells work together. They all work together. Please know the function of all these cells. I will definitely ask you questions on exam number 3 on all the cells of the stomach. Oh, look, H2O plus CO2 gives you carbonic acid. Carbonic acid is broken down into hydrogen and bicarbonate. Remember this formula, a very important formula. And now you know what happens to the hydrogen. The hydrogen attaches to the chloride and forms hydrochloric acid in the stomach. In the stomach. Okay? Very, very important. There are 2 very important enzymes that are in your stomach. One of them, you know, is carbonic anhydrase. The other is HK-ATPase. This is known as the proton pump. The proton pump, because it produces hydrogen, which attaches to chlorine to form hydrochloric acid. Why is that important? Because if you have too much hydrochloric acid in your stomach, you will get an ulcer. You will get gastroesophageal reflux disease. How do we treat that? We treat that with a protein pump inhibitor known as a PPI. A PPI. Okay? You know it as Zantac. You know it as Zantac. You can get it over the counter. So if you have acidity and you want to get rid of it, you will inhibit the protein pump to not produce hydrogen. If you don't produce hydrogen, you can't attach to chloride. So you will inhibit the production of hydrochloric acid. Hydrochloric acid. That's very, very important. You can also take antacids. What are antacids? Antacids are bicarbonate or bicarbonate. So if in this formula, if you overdose this formula with bicarbonate, you make less hydrogen. Does everybody understand what we're talking about here? We're talking about medicine. And what is the basis of taking a medicine for too much acid in your stomach? You can take bicarbonate, which will lower the amount of carbonic acid, or you can take a protein pump inhibitor, which will lower the amount of hydrogen, therefore lowering the amount of hydrochloric acid. Everybody okay with that?
Yes.
Yes. Good. All right, here we go. This is a good review. It's a good review of all the cells in the stomach and what they do, and also talks about the pyloric sphincter, which is the muscle that controls the passage of chyme from the stomach to the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine. All right? The pancreas. The pancreas lies posterior to the stomach. The pancreas produces the majority of enzymes in the digestive tract. It produces enzymes that degrade everything. It produces enzymes that digest starch, proteins, fats, and even nucleic acids. It is an accessory gland. It is attached by a duct to the duodenum. It produces sodium bicarbonate, which buffers stomach acid. Remember, the chyme coming from the stomach is full of hydrochloric acid. And once it gets into the duodenum, it can cause an ulcer, otherwise known as a duodenal ulcer. If it wasn't for the pancreas buffering this acid with sodium bicarbonate, all of us would have a duodenal ulcer. So this is the pancreas, the big producer of enzymes. And here's where the pancreas is. It's posterior to the stomach. Here's the stomach. It's posterior to the stomach and connects to the duodenum through the pancreatic duct, Okay? So that's very, very important to understand. This is a live person, well, actually a dead person, and here is the pancreas right here. Now, the pancreas itself is a digestive enzyme producer. 90% of the pancreas functions as the producer of enzymes involved in digestion. 10% of the pancreas is an endocrine organ producing two hormones, which we'll talk about in the endocrine system. You don't have to know those two hormones. But the pancreas is the big enzyme producer in the GI tract. Okay? So you also have two other accessory organs in the GI tract, and those accessory organs are the liver and the gallbladder. The liver makes bile. The reason for bile is it's needed in the emulsification of fat. Without bile, you would have fat in your stools. They would be very greasy. So the liver makes bile to emulsify these fats. The function of the gallbladder is to store the bile. That's its sole function. The gallbladder stores bile. Okay? That's important. That's important. All of these things are connected. There is a right hepatic duct from the liver and a left hepatic duct. They come together forming the common hepatic duct. The common hepatic duct attaches to the cystic duct from the gallbladder, giving us the common bile duct. The common bile duct attaches to the pancreatic duct, and both these ducts empty into the duodenum. So the enzymes from the pancreas and the bile from the common bile duct all empty into the duodenum. That is extremely important to understand. Okay? The common hepatic duct with the cystic duct makes the common bile duct. The common bile duct with the pancreatic duct all empties into the duodenum. The liver is composed of cells called hepatocytes. These cells are extremely active. They're active in producing proteins. They're active in producing fibrinogen, gamma globulin, all of those necessary proteins that you learned about in the blood system lecture, albumin. They produce all those proteins, but the liver is also involved in digestion. Remember, it produces bile. It produces bile, okay? And where does bile come from? Does anyone know where bile actually comes from? You learned it in your blood lecture.
The liver.
It does come from the liver, but how is it made? What is it made from? What is bile made from? Remember when I showed you the slide on when blood cells are degraded after 120 days, what happens to them? The hemoglobin is divided into heme and globin. The globin goes back to the bone marrow, and the heme part is destroyed, and it makes bile. It makes bile. It makes urobilinogen. It makes bilirubin. That's part of bile. This is why bile is brown in color, because it comes from red cells. It comes from red cells. Okay? You don't have to know too much more about the liver. Just know it is a very important factory that makes a lot of stuff. Okay? I'm not going to ask you to blood supply the liver. That's not important. But the functions are very important. The liver is involved in carbohydrate, lipid, and protein metabolism. The liver processes all the drugs that you take into it: alcohol, aspirin. It also produces hormones. It excretes bilirubin. It makes bile salt. Without bile salt, you can't emulsify fats. The gallbladder stores the bile. The liver also produces phagocytes that kill bacteria. When the skin absorbs vitamin D, the liver activates it. The liver takes vitamin D and turns it into vitamin D3, and that's how it activates it. So the liver is the powerhouse of the GI system. The powerhouse of the GI system is the liver. The enzyme producer of the GI tract is the pancreas. Any questions so far?
I had a quick question.
Go.
And this might just be something that I just misheard from like my doctors about how certain medications metabolize either in the liver or the kidney. Is that true, or they're all in the liver?
There is no metabolism of your drugs in your kidney, but there is excretion, but not metabolism.
Okay, thank you.
But metabolism of drugs is only in the liver, only. Okay?
I heard that too.
Anything else? Let's go down from the stomach through the pyloric sphincter into the small intestine. The proximal part of the small intestine is called the duodenum. The middle of the small intestine is called the jejunum. The distal end of the small intestine is called the ileum. The majority of digestion, the majority of absorption in the GI tract is in your small intestine. There's some digestion in the mouth. There's some digestion in the stomach, but the majority of digestion and 90% of absorption is in the small intestine. Very important to understand that. The small intestine also has folds that move food. In the stomach, they're called rugae. In the small intestine, they're called segmentations. These segmentations move the chyme, or spelled wrong, with digestive juices and bring the food in contact with the mucosa for absorption. The act of moving food through the digestive tract is called peristalsis. So the movement of food is called peristalsis. In the stomach, it's the rugae. In the small intestine, it's segmentations. 90% of all absorption in the GI tract into the bloodstream is done in the small intestine. The small intestine completes the digestion of starch, proteins, fats, and begins and completes the digestion of nucleic acids. What does that mean? That means that nucleic acids are only digested and completed in the small intestine. Here it is. The small intestine absorbs 90% of the nutrients and water that pass through the digestive system. There are folds in the small intestine called plica circularis. They are equal to the rugae of the stomach. They increase the surface area so that the chyme can be absorbed. Plica circularis. Just like in the stomach, there are cells in the small intestine, but the majority of these cells have only one function, and that one function is to absorb the chyme into the bloodstream. So basically, the majority of cells in the stomach are absorptive cells, okay? You also have some modified cells that are in the small intestine. One of them is the Paneth cell, and the Paneth cell is full of macrophages. These are the cells that house killers of bacteria, the Paneth cell. You also have goblet cells. And the goblet cells, whenever you see that word goblet, it's filled with mucus. So the mucus cells of the small intestine are called goblet cells. You also have, in the small intestine, you have lacteals. And the reason you have these lacteals is because fat cannot be absorbed into the bloodstream without attaching to a protein. When fat attaches to a protein, it is called a chylomicron. And that chylomicron goes into these lacteals, and then the chylomicron is absorbed into the lymphatic system. Remember, it is fat, and all fat is absorbed in the lymphatic system. It's taken into the lymphatic system, and it's dropped into the subclavian vein and then into the blood. You learn that in the lymphatic system, okay? The other cell in the small intestine that's important is the EE cell, the enteroendocrine cell. And this cell produces two hormones. And we'll talk about those two hormones in another slide, okay? But the majority of these cells are absorptive cells because 90% of all absorption takes place in the small intestine. So you have intestinal juice. And intestinal juice is all the enzymes, all the water, and all the chyme that is in the small intestine. This attaches to the brushed border of the villi of the small intestine and is all absorbed into the bloodstream. Here's a lacteal. Here's the microvilli of it. And this is where you have the absorptive cells, the goblet cells, mucus, the Paneth cells, which produce lysozyme, which is capable of killing things, kills bacteria. And here you have the EE cell, which secretes two hormones. And those hormones are secretin and cholecystokinin. otherwise known as CCK. So these are your 4 cells that are in the microvilli of the small intestine. The more abundant is the absorptive cell. Then you have the mucus cell, which is the goblet cell, the EE cell, the hormone producer, and the PANF cell, which produces the enzyme lysozyme to kill bacteria. So the localized contractions of the GI tract is segmentation. The localized contractions of the stomach are rugae. But the propulsion of chyme in the stomach and in the small intestine and also the large intestine is called peristalsis. That's mechanical digestion. Mechanical digestion. In the small intestine, you digest everything. You digest carbohydrates from the amylase and lipase of the pancreas. Remember, the pancreatic duct attaches to the common bile duct and it empties into the duodenum. You also digest protein. We'll talk about some of their enzymes. You also digest lipids from the pancreatic lipase, and you also digest nucleic acids. The only time you digest nucleic acids is in the small intestine. Here is what we're talking about. The pancreas. The pancreas delivers pancreatic juice, which contains all the enzymes. The liver produces bile salts necessary in the emulsification and absorption of liquids. The gallbladder stores bile. The small intestine is digesting and absorbing nutrients, the absorptive cells. The goblet cells secrete mucus. The enteroendocrine cells secrete secretin and cholecystokinin. The PANF cells produce lysozymes which kill bacteria. Okay? And the other things you really don't have to know. Segmentation is important because it is peristalsis in the small intestine. So here are the enzymes that I want you to know. This is a great review. Saliva. Remember, chemical digestion takes place in the mouth. So does mechanical digestion. The salivary glands produce amylase. Amylase degrades starch. Polysaccharides become disaccharides. Lipase, produced by the lingual glands under the tongue, they get rid of fat. They take triglycerides and turn them into fatty acids and glycerol. In the stomach, pepsin, which is activated from pepsinogen by hydrochloric acid, comes from the chief cells. Pepsin degrades proteins into peptides. Gastric lipase from the chief cells of the stomach does the same thing to triglycerides. Pancreatic amylase, the main producer of amylase in the GI tract is the pancreas. It degrades starch into disaccharides. Trypsin, chymotrypsin, elastase, carboxypeptidase. All of these 4 enzymes degrade protein. Degrade protein. Pancreatic lipase. The majority of lipase in the GI tract comes from the pancreas. It degrades triglycerides into fatty acids and glycerol. The nucleases, ribonuclease and deoxyribonuclease, comes from the pancreas, and it degrades RNA and DNA. RNA and DNA. And it drops its materials into the small intestine. The first time you see nucleases is in the small intestine. The first time nucleic acids are degraded is in the small intestine. Okay? Don't worry about the brush border enzymes. They are not important in the scheme of things. Know this slide. Know this slide. Okay, it just shows you what is absorbed. Shows you what's absorbed. All of these things, sugars, fructose, glucose, galactose, amino acids, di and tripeptide, fatty acids, they're all absorbed into the blood in the small intestine. Again, 90% of all absorption is in the small intestine. Okay? Very important. Very important. You can look at that at your leisure. Okay? This is a lacteal. This is a lacteal. Remember, I told you that fat cannot go through the barriers. It has to attach to a protein. And when fat attaches to a protein, you get what's called a chylomicron. It is a combination of fat or lipid and protein. It's called a lipoprotein. This goes into the lymphatic system and goes into the subclavian vein, into the bloodstream. So as you learn from the lymphatic system, fat cannot go directly into the bloodstream. It has to be attached to protein, making a lipoprotein, and then into the lymphatic system, and then into the bloodstream at the subclavian vein. Okay? This is important to show you how much fluid is absorbed. 90% of all fluid absorbed is in the small intestine. Here it is. Look here. 1 liter of saliva, 2 to 3 liters, 2.3 liters of liquid. All this fluid is absorbed by the small intestine. Look at it. 8.3 liters is absorbed into the bloodstream in the small intestine. What happens to the other 10% of liquid? The other 10% of liquid is absorbed by the large intestine. So 90% of everything is absorbed. Nutrients and liquid is absorbed by the small intestine, and the remaining 10% of liquid is absorbed by the large intestine. Okay? Again, you have 4 systems in your body that get rid of waste. One is the respiratory system. We talked about the respiratory system. Okay? It gets rid of waste the fastest because it gets rid of carbon dioxide, which basically, from the formula, is carbonic acid. Okay? You also have the urinary system. Its function is to get rid of water. All of the water that is absorbed by the large intestine and small intestine goes to the kidneys. You have your skin, which is negligible amounts of water and electrolytes that go out. But you also have feces. The GI system gets rid of waste also. It gets rid of feces. Okay? And that feces is only 10% of water. So 90% of the water that is absorbed in your body gets rid of, but the small intestine puts into your bloodstream is urinated out by the urinary system. All right? So now we go from the small intestine into the large intestine. Okay? There is a valve that regulates the amount of chyme that gets into the large intestine. The distal end of the small intestine is called the ileum. Duodenum, jejunum, ileum. The beginning of the large intestine is called the cecum. The valve that regulates small intestine chyme into the large intestine is called the ileocecal sphincter. First part of the large intestine is the cecum. The feces now travels to the ascending colon, then to the transverse colon, then through the descending colon, into the sigmoid colon, into the rectum, into the anal canal, into the anus, and out to the toilet. That is the pathway of food in the large intestine. And before I forget about it, I want you to know the pathway of food through the GI tract. Just like you learned the pathway of blood through the heart, I want you to know the pathway of food from the mouth to the anus. Okay? There is a worm-like appendage in the cecum called the appendix. The word veriform means worm-like. Worm-like. It is the appendix. This is actually part of the lymphatic system because in the appendix there are lymphocytes that kill bacteria. And when it gets blocked or overwhelmed with bacteria, you have appendicitis. You have appendicitis. And 10 years ago, you needed your appendix taken out, but not anymore. Now we're just treating it with antibiotics, unless the appendix perforates. And if the appendix perforates, it lets bacteria and feces into the peritoneal cavity, and you get peritonitis, and you need to have your appendix taken out because there's a hole in your appendix that needs to be taken out. But if you don't have peritonitis, appendicitis today is treated with antibiotics. Okay? In the colon, which is part of the large intestine, there is haustra. Haustra. And it is the localized regions of musculature that churns and moves the food. In the stomach, it was rugae. In the small intestine, it was cerca plicularis, otherwise known as segmentations. In the colon, it's known as haustra. okay? And it drives the food into the rectum. In the colon, there are bacteria, good and bad bacteria, that break down proteins into amino acids. They break down amino acids and they produce vitamins. They produce some B vitamins. Okay? Also in the colon, bacteria that live there give your feces a smell. Give your feces a smell. Okay? In the colon, the function of the colon is to absorb water, ions, and vitamins that the small intestine missed. So 10% of the water and ions and vitamins that are absorbed in the small intestine in the bloodstream is absorbed in the colon. The colon also formats your feces and directs the rectum to leave to get the feces out of your body, and that's called defecation. Okay? So now you have cells of the colon. There are only two important cells in the colon. One of them is absorptive cells to get the other 10% of water into the bloodstream with the ions and the nutrients that the small intestine missed, and also mucus cells, goblet cells, to get the feces slick enough to get out. Okay? Absorptive cells and goblet cells. Here they are. Absorptive cells absorb water, goblet cells secrete mucus. So in the colon, the mechanical digestion is because of hostra. And then you have peristalsis, and then you have what's called mass peristalsis. Mass peristalsis is when you have the urge to defecate. It is a strong peristaltic wave that begins in the transverse colon and quickly drives the contents of the colon into the rectum, and you better sit down on the toilet because you're going to have a bowel movement. That's called mass peristalsis. The last stages of digestion occur through bacterial action. Substances are broken down by bacteria. It also adds a smell to your feces, and some vitamins are made by bacterial action in your colon. So in your colon, you have good and bad bacteria. The bad bacteria will give you a smell to your feces. The good bacteria will synthesize vitamins. The majority of absorption is the function of the colon. It absorbs water, electrolytes, and vitamins. What is feces? It's water, salt, epithelial cells, bacteria, and undigested portions of food. The bacteria give the feces smell. Somebody tell me what gives the color to the feces. If you're still awake.
Did we talk about this earlier? The
Bilirubin, I think, right?
Thank you very much. Bilirubin. Yes, we did talk about it earlier. I'm just making sure you understand. Everybody got that?
yes.
Good. The defecation reflex. We bring the brown to the bowl. The rectal wall distends. The stress receptors send sensory nerve impulses to the sacral spinal cord. The motor impulses travel back to the descending colon, sigmoid colon, rectum, and anus, and the longitudinal rectal muscles contract. Your internal anal sphincter opens, your external anal sphincter opens, and you leave a deposit in the toilet. Okay? Very important to understand that if you have a spinal injury, you are unable to defecate. You cannot defecate. If you have a spinal injury to your sacral cord or above, you cannot urinate. So people with spinal injuries cannot defecate nor urinate. That's very important to understand. And this just shows you the digestive activities in the large intestine. It's basically due to bacterial activity, okay? Because the majority of the function of the large intestine is to absorb the remaining 10% of water. But here I want you to see that vitamin K is made from bacteria in your colon, So if you take antibiotics and you kill these bacteria, you won't be able to make certain vitamins. What happens if you don't make vitamin K? What are the symptoms of not having enough vitamin K in your blood? You should have learned that from the blood system. I'm waiting for an answer. Say it.
Doesn't it not purify your liver? Or like it's like the purifier of the blood or something like that?
Not really. Why is vitamin K important?
Electrical rhythm?
No. Electrical rhythm is calcium, actually. Tell me, but just like calcium, vitamin K in the blood, they work together. Tell me why vitamin K is important. You should have learned this in the blood system.
Is it because your blood can't clot without it?
Thank you. Your blood cannot clot without it. So if you're taking antibiotics and you kill the bacteria that make vitamin K, you're going to bruise. You're going to bleed. You're going to have problems. So that's very important to understand. Okay? And this is a summary. And it's a good summary. It goes from the tongue all the way down to the large intestine. It tells you the major function of the GI tract. There it is, okay? There are phases of digestion, okay? Let me ask you a question. There are three phases, the cephalic, the gastric, and the intestinal. Let me ask you a question. Do you have to put food into your mouth before you produce saliva?
No.
No.
The answer is no. You are correct. Let me ask you this question. Can you get a duodenal or a gastric ulcer without eating any food?
Yes.
Yes, because just the thought of food stimulates gastric secretion, stimulates gastric motility. When you stimulate gastric secretion, you produce hydrochloric acid. You produce pepsin. You start degrading protein. You start degrading carbohydrates. That's the cephalic phase. The thought of food will stimulate gastric secretion. The gastric phase is when you have food into your stomach. The intestinal phase is when you have food into your small and large intestines. Okay? So it can all work before you put food into your mouth. And that's what this slide really shows. Okay? It shows that everything works together. Everything works together. All right? Now, I told you that the GI tract produces hormones. And the three hormones that you need to know from the GI tract are gastrin, secretin, and CCK. And yes, I will accept CCK as an answer if you have to fill in the blank. Okay? Gastrin. Gastrin is produced by the enteroendocrine cells of the stomach. Its major effects: it promotes the secretion of gastric juice. It increases gastric motility, and it produces the growth of the gastric mucosa. And it comes from the G cells of the stomach. Secretin and cholecystokinin come from the EE cells of the small intestine. Secretin stimulates the secretion of pancreatic juice and bile that are rich in bicarbonate ions to nullify the hydrochloric acid that's coming from the stomach being dropped into the duodenum. Cholecystokinin, produced by the EE cells of the small intestine, stimulate also the secretion of pancreatic juice, and causes the ejection of bile from the gallbladder, and induces the feeling of being full. I'll stop eating now. Okay? So those are the three hormones of the GI tract that I want you to know. No, I'm not going to talk to you anything about embryology. That's not important. What happens when you age? Everything doesn't work like it should. Everything doesn't work like it should. That's for sure. I can guarantee you that. And these are some of the homeostatic mechanisms. And here are some of the diseases. I'm probably going to talk about some of the diseases that I didn't give you a PowerPoint on. But someone is going to talk about hepatitis, and someone's going to talk about colon cancer also. Okay. I think we got it. Let's get out of here. Let's stop recording.